Hello there. Thanks for coming out to episode 2 of Spice of Life Studio TV. It's this the second in the series after the first one, which was the history of Spice of Life seeds. Today I thought we could talk a little bit about selective breeding for those who are new to it. It's a beautiful hobby, and it's foundational to the existence of the species. If you're not breeding it, it's not long for this world. So everybody can pitch in and help. I always think is a bit sometimes like a million monkeys with typewriters could come up with Shakespeare. And that's part of the beauty of it, that decentralization. So much can happen. The more people pop in seeds, the more interesting selections can be found. And everybody that's experimenting in different ways with it, they all contribute something. And, it's a fun thing to be a part of. It's a really, if you're a aficionado of cannabis, you'll come to grow it inevitably, really. It's hard to really appreciate it the same, I think, if you don't grow your own. If you haven't grown your own, you may have been stoned, but you've never been high. That's how I think of it. You feel free to disagree. But once you start growing your own, whether out of necessity, as in the old days, or now, even though there's an abundance of selection, people still like to breed their own. In the old days and in much of the world, seeds aren't easy to come by, or weren't easy to come by. And now in North America, at least, there's never been greater availability to a home grower of seeds to choose from. And sure, you can talk about genetics bottleneck and all that, but people have access to cannabis. And the seeds really are something that has traveled well traditionally, and they can keep longer than a clone. If you need to shut down for the winter and go away, maybe you just like growing in the summer, which is what I do for personal at home. I don't keep light burning year round, so it's really nice to save anything you're working with or you enjoy as seeds. Now we're spoiled for choice now. Lately, I've just been putting out a few cuts of whatever friends recommend, so I get to try something new every summer. And sometimes I'll throw in an old favorite or two as well. But really, that's straight hobbyist. And when I started, we didn't really have that luxury of selection, so you had to conserve what you found that you liked, and that's the basis of it. So any grower on any scale can start seeding a bottom branch of a plant to save seeds. So it's the start of something. And we all start out as a pollen chucker. Don't let anybody tell you different. That's how it starts. So let's just explore a little bit what the terminology is around the seeds that you could be starting with. And if you want to go further, eventually you may go pro and start doing registered seed and certified seed. And that's a whole other discussion. We won't go there today, but it's worthy of note. We're just talking about the basics of selective breeding today, which is truly all I'm properly qualified to discuss. I've done more than that, but that's totally how I started, was as a hobbyist, and I really recommend it as a hobby to everybody that loves to grow their own. It's a fun, it's hard when you're constrained to 3 plants or 6 plants or some arbitrary number, because it's a numbers game and you want to start as many as you can, ideally, and then thin them out ruthlessly. So we all stand on the shoulders of giants. There's been people saving seeds for millennia. None of us invented cannabis, but some of us have chosen to, put our fingerprint on it along the way. But we're all links in a long chain that just continues on. And if it didn't, that would be a problem. So it doesn't matter how many strands of that chain are out there. We can go as wide as we want. There's no limit to how many people can start their own breeding project. And it's just, to me, a fabulous hobby at the very least. So if you're, and there's, even with the terms in that, there's often some confusion, I'll say confusion or disagreement even over the definitions, such as with landrace seeds. To some people, that means, traditionally farm stuff that was collected, but that's still domesticated. And to others, it means undomesticated wild stands that are just growing without human hand, So I think landrace is, to me, the wild stands. And the domesticated ones have become heirlooms, and they may have been in one place for hundreds of years, like Santa Marta Gold, for example, which, I've been told by those with more sequencing skills that its origins are West African seed, which wouldn't be shocking, as a lot of traffic came through that way. And hemp was the sails and ropes of everything, and I bet quickly transpired that European hemp didn't do too well in the tropics. So if they found some, there's stops along the way, quite potential that the ship would have taken some on and tried it out. So anyways, who knows? That's just speculation. But the plant has moved around the world. And, some people say it started in Southeast Asia, and some people say the Rift Valley, and some people say in the mountains in Asia. There's no way I can say definitively. There's really interesting theories to read about the origins of it. The one where I'd read about it coming out of Thailand said that by the time it got to East Africa, people were still consuming it or using it as a topical, but nobody was smoking it apparently until it hit West Africa, where that's where the oldest smoking implements have been found. So I found that to be a very interesting story. The West Africans made the first pipes and bongs out of it. I mean, who knows? It all happened so long ago. But again, I digress, as I tend to after a nice bubbly hit. Anyway, when I think of the start of my growing experience, it was based on what I read in Ask Ed and High Times and Best of Sensimilla tips from Tom Alexander and Mel Frank's Grower Guide. And at the same time, I got Robert Connell Clark's Marijuana Botany. And that was, totally inspirational. Sensi tips had you thinking more about the organic cultivation and that. And Mel Frank's book was a good general overview. Ed always brought some monthly humor to his Ask Ed column, which I got a kick out of. One time, this stuck with me, not the letter to him, but his response. But somebody sent in, some fairly obvious, observation. And his response was, "Thanks for the observation, Shaggy." And I still crack up about that. He's a funny guy. And bless him all. But Marijuana Botany, so well thought out, and his diagrams of the different leaf. And you could just see that Rob was really into the plant, and is such an eye-opener about all the diversity. And as a breeder today, you can still draw on so much from so many places. There's just an absolute wealth of selection out there. And I know there's always going to be people say, at the top, it's bottlenecking, and lots of the land races have been wiped out. And this is all true, But on the positive side, the average person can order seeds from a seed bank online that represents every region in Africa and Asia, or any modern hybrids they can dream up, and they're crossing the new with the new as fast as you want. So, I mean, there's just something for everybody. If you like the funky stuff, if you like the sweet stuff, if you like the perfume stuff, there's really so many profiles out there that, you know, don't let anybody tell you, oh, it's not cool to like this or that, whatever. You know, taste is subjective, it is entirely up to you. Your body knows what it likes, and just obey your taste, you know. So as you start developing this connoisseurship and, you know, starting to understand all the potential building blocks out there, you might want to lean a certain direction with some lines and not with others. But, you know, you can have a range of pots. I mean, either it would be very dull if you just had jars full of one type. You know, I like to have lots of different flavors to draw on. I don't need a big quantity of each for personal consumption, but I like to have a good range of flower. And if I do have a good quantity of each, I tend to reduce them as hash, because I love hash. It really gets to the point. You don't need all the fiber schmiber and the waxes and all the things that make up a plant. You think it's kind of like, you know, you want to have an apple. You don't want to have a whole apple tree, you know? So to me, the resin glands are the apples, and the rest of it's just a tree they hang on. So while I can appreciate flower, and I really do appreciate flower, but just as often, if not more, I like to hash as my go-to. And that's a whole other story, and we'll get into that, and we'll cover some different ways of making it and that. But this one, we want to talk about getting you started breeding your own. So as I continue to run in circles with this topic, anyways, if the basic concept is like begets like, and you are going to choose a couple of plants that you like, ideally a male and a female to get started. Feminized is another can of worms, and it's a useful tool in seed production, but seed breeding is still best accomplished with males and females to keep a, you know, fuller profile, I think, in the chromosomes, to make it that genotype. So when we talk about genotype or phenotype, we're talking about a genotype is the genetic potential for a line, and it sort of holds all the options within, and the phenotype is how an individual plant expresses it. So you're going to, you know, the expressions could be something as obvious as a purple expression and a green expression, you know. So it came out of the same seed lines, and they're the same genotype, that bag of seeds that came from the same parents. But as they are grown out and they reflect which traits they're dominant in that plant, one of them is going to be dominant for purple and one of them is going to be dominant for green. Has the potential to go either way, but that's what they came up with, you know. So every recombination is another roll of the dice. So the more plants you're selecting from, the wider the choice you'll have. Even if, you know, if you start 10 seeds, you're going to find a representative sample. If you start 250 seeds, you might even find a couple recessive traits that you didn't notice or didn't show up in the pack of 10. If you go and start 10,000 seeds, that doesn't mean you're going to find one that's 1,000 times better than the pack. You know, your gains are incremental after a while, but you're still most likely going to find some better examples from 10,000 lot of seed than from a 10 pack of seed, right? So that it just stands to reason. It is a numbers game. So it's really, you know, time consuming, resource consuming to go through and maintain all these plants and backups of them. It's not necessarily an efficient production strategy. If you're just producing weight, you're better off with something that's absolutely stable and you're not hunting through it. You're probably planting from clones or from very stable seed, of which there's very little of out there at this time. But if you have stable seed, you can plant very efficiently from seed that way. Getting back away from production considerations to just doing a selection crop, that first selection crop is going to be the foundation of the future stuff. So even if you're a producer and you just want to make sure that you've got the best possible genetics for your brand new greenhouse in whichever zone you've put it, you're really wise to start a lot of seeds and find out who's happiest there. And then even if you're just going to produce from clones, you don't need to do any further breeding with it. You can just keep cloning that plant indefinitely, right? So there's really a lot to be said from doing selections because they'll really fit, they're the best possible choice of what you can have for that specific garden. Every garden's a little bit different. And I know indoors, you can tweak it to be whatever you want, basically. So you're not accommodating high humidity or other issues, which you might be in a other environment. But, that's a whole other story. Controlling the environment, that's great. You can do whatever you want in there. But not every plant likes the same environment. So once you've, established what's best in your environment, then you've got the basis of what you're going to work with. And you might really have you might favor lime and say, oh, I really love this one. It really smells like lime. But I think I've got to put it with this other one that's like grape lollipops because I just can't stop smacking my lips after I hit it. It's so sweet. And that, succulent lime taste is going to be so fun on that grape lollipop plant, So go ahead, cross them. If you've got a male from either one of them, that's the ideal, And what you might choose to do is to take the pollen of the purple male in this case, the grape lollipop, let's say. So you take that pollen, you use it to pollinate a branch of itself, its favorite sister, your favorite sister of it. And then also you can hit your other plant and make a hybrid. So if the two plants that you start with were fairly stable lines, then you've got a true F1 hybrid. If both of the plants you were starting with, or either of them, were unstable lines, they're probably polyhybrids that are getting crossed against polyhybrids. And in this case, when you start doing your pheno hunt, which is why pheno hunting has become such a thing over the years that people are always talking about pheno hunting, because they've never seen seeds that produced reliably stable lines. Everything they've seen has like 8 different expressions, which is, classic polyhybrid behavior, maybe more. But I've seen some 12, 13 different expressions. And you'd think, is this a mixed bag of seed, or is it really just that unstable? And the fact is a lot of it's really that unstable. So you can have fun isolating and stabilizing your favorite expressions from that pheno hunt. And or, it's best to start stabilizing them before you start crossing them with other stuff, ideally, So where do you go from there? If you keep at least 2 lines to maintain something, so this would be line breeding, let's say, inbred lines. So if you just started out with that mother-father cross of 2 different things, you could take out the progeny. Say you found 2 mothers that really represent what you're going for when you started 10,000 seeds or 1,000 seeds of your first cross. So you said, okay, I crossed my lime with my grape. Now I'm going to grow out as many as I can. Well, you don't necessarily need to finish all 1,000 seeds or all 10,000 seeds. I would typically start the 10,000 seeds in trays, and after 10 days, 2 weeks, I would transplant them to 10 centimeter, 4-inch pots, and I would only transplant the best 3/4 of them, 75, 80% generally. So if we go with the 3/4, say 75%, now you're down to, I'd take the best 25% the best 25% of those trays I would transplant. I would cull 75% of them. So that has dropped the numbers from 10,000 seedlings to 2,500. The next transplant, I might take out 2,000, cull them, and transplant the best 500 into 1 gallon or 2 gallon pots, and then let them get going up a little bit. And a couple of weeks later, I can say, okay, these are my favorite 100. I'm going to kill the other 400, and I'm going to take my favorite 100 out to the field and check how they behave. And then at the end of the day, from that 100, I may or may not pick a couple of great plants, or I may just reject the line because I've made a few crosses each time generally. So if you had, say you had one favorite female from that first cross, and you said, oh, I love this one. It has the best of both parents. So you say, but which male should I use? It's hard to tell. These two both have the right smell in the stems. They have the same taxonomy, structure and leaf structure and everything. These look like the male twins of my favorite female. So, but you can use those 2 males, and you could pollinate them separately onto 2 different branches or 2 different clones or in 2 different closets. And you could make 2 lines of that. And those are 2 F2 lines. And then you could grow them out, do the same thing again. And then you've got 4 F3 lines if you want, After the F3, they get crossed back together, the 2 lines. You take your best F3 line from each side, from each side of the family. So that keeping those 2 lines running in parallel allows you to cross them back together to maintain some semblance of stability while continuing forward. And that's very traditional selective breeding practice. So that is how so many, traditional vegetable seed companies and everything have maintained their lines for long, long time. That's very normal practice. Now, the more space you have, maybe the more lines you want to keep. And every time you're doing a pollination of an inbred line, you could choose to do a back cross at the same time using the same pollen to one of the parents. So that's another option, and you can keep back cross lines as well. So you do run the risk of them becoming inbred sooner, but you've also got the option to do it because it's a bit of a quicker path to stabilizing sometimes. So, and one reason I'd like to use back crossing is sometimes you only have a female of a certain line, and you think, boy, I wish I had a male that matched this, but I don't. So I'm going to use something different, complementary but different, to cross it with, and then cross back to the mother until I get a seed that is the closest representation I've been able to make, lacking the male. So that's one technique. And you do it one time as a back cross. And in traditional botany, that would be marked as BC, or in botany, I should say that marked as BC. You do that a second time, you have squared it. You do it a third time, and you've cubed it. And that cubed line is going to, probably make seeds that are really quite representative of that line. You can plant a room full of them or a field full of them without seeing a ton of deviation Let's say, there's the first time I did did a project to cube the plant was a sweet pink grapefruit cutting I had. I had no male that matched it. So I crossed it with a blueberry male I found. It was outstanding, and I've talked about it before, but it had very purple stalks, very different leaves, and just was obviously a different plant, so it was a fairly wide cross, if you like. And it actually made a fantastic F1 anyway, and that was my original sweet tooth. And then as I made the F2 lines, I was also backcrossing to grapefruit, so I could start to get a more stabilized grapefruit type seed. So that was my first experience with backcrossing. And curiously, I'd never seen it on any other cannabis seed catalogs. But I had so many plant tags in my library that, of plants that said BC hash plant or BC Kush or BC Big Bud or BC Purple Haze, and they were just the names of the plant. There was the Dutch Big Bud was different than the BC Big Bud, so the BC was already on so many tags around my garden. I said, I backcross, I can't add BC again. So I put BX. And that was my contribution to misnomers in cannabis, because BC is the correct term. It was just inconvenient in BC to be using that. So I used BX, and that became the cannabis industry standard later, which I always chuckle about. I see it all the time. But I never saw a backcross on another seed catalog before that, and now you're hard pressed to find a seed catalog that doesn't have them. So I think it's an interesting tool. It can't be the only tool in your toolbox, just like feminizing can't be the only tool in your toolbox. But the ideal is breeding with both males and females, and keeping those lines and keeping them fresh by reintroducing them to each other every couple generations. So we've discussed a little bit about inbred lines, about backcross lines, about genotypes and phenotypes. And let me just check my notes here, because unfortunately I made notes today, which are an absolute distraction if I start looking at them. But there's lots of different ways of doing pollen collection and pollen applications. People have found what works for them, and that's often down to the scale that they're working on. But I'll tell you exactly what I did to start with when I made my very first seeds, which was at a gorilla patch too. So I had to be, in and out and fairly quiet. And the one summer I remember being, I think it was my second or third summer growing, I believe. Yeah. And one friend I had picked up some cuttings from, I thought were cuttings, in the springtime. And I got out and planted them. And midsummer, of these 3 plants in the one patch, I realized I had a big male. I was like, oh, shoot. I didn't want a big male of my 3 plants. Here's barely worth running the risk to grow when it's like that anyway, let alone to have the male out there. So I sure didn't want it on the females, at least in quantity. So I made a point of cutting it down, but I waited until the flowers were close to opening, but not open. And I managed to time it just right. And what I did was I snipped tops, and I would take a shoebox. I would line the shoebox with parchment paper and then put cheesecloth in it over the parchment paper. And then I tape a male bud to the top of the shoebox. And then I would just open it every day, maybe even more the first days, to let some moisture out. But it took a day or two, and then that male opened its flower sacs and dropped the pollen. And it was super easy just to lift out the cheesecloth that had all the, stamens and male flower parts that had dropped. I'd lift that out. There was that nice light golden pollen on the parchment paper underneath. And I would just fold that up and tape it in the shape of a little envelope. And it was like an envelope with pollen in it. And then I went back down to the site and, got back there a few days later, and I slit the end of the envelope open, and then I just slip it over bottom branch. And I made sure I was doing it while it wasn't windy or anything, because I really didn't want any more than that one bottom bud on a bottom branch covered in seeds, and it made so many seeds, and there wasn't a single seed in the rest of the plant. So it was really a great way to go. And then I was like, wow. So I got, I think, 2 or 3 film canisters of seeds off of this bottom branch, because I really slipped it over and got the top, but then, sprinkled any more on the bottom, just that bottom branch. There was nothing else, no other seeds in the plant. It smoked clean. So I thought, yeah, you can be careful and you can do this. And then I was like, wow, this is a great selection of seeds. And because it is, it was good weed. So I was happy with that. And you didn't know every year what you might find the next spring unless you started making your own seed. So I just got in the habit of doing that out of necessity. And it became such a hobby because, I collected seed or cuts from all different friends that would come across stuff. Sometimes a friend would come back from Holland or come back from a fishing trip in the West Coast or from a trip to Hawaii. We had really distinct range. We always, lots of Canadians go to Mexico, and a little bit of Mexican brickweed used to make it up to Canada back then. And Jamaican brickweed used to make it to Canada back then. So there was lots of time to look through seeds, and I would just had to be ruthless about culling them. If I had, more seeds to plant than I was possibly going to grow, because I was really just growing for head stash, and it was very illegal. Even one plant would have got you real problems at the time back then. And I would never put out more than 3 on a planting trip, and I wouldn't plant all 3 right side by side. I would go, to one, it would be one hike, let's say. So to take out those 3, I might start 100 in trays in a friend's backyard or something, and then say, okay, these 3 are really shining, or these 4 are really shining. I'm going to keep those and take them out. And I just say, you can have the rest of them or kill them or whatever. But I was really adamant about selecting for Vigour at a young age from, as many different lines as I could get my hands on. So I think the first time I ever harvested flower, I grew it from Jamaican brickweed seeds. And I had started 2,000 seeds in a friend's mom's backyard, who said, you can start your seeds here, but then you got to get them out. So he said, okay. So my friend and his brothers, they wanted to crack it growing. And I was the only one that had some seeds, because I'd saved all the seeds from the Jamaican I'd been smoking that winter. And they said, okay, we planted them. They got to be they went into 4-inch pots or 10-centimeter pots, let's say. And there was so many, and they were obviously tropical origin, but there was one plant that started flowering before all the other ones, and it was a female, and it had hairs before anything. It was showing its sex, and not just showing its sex, but it actually was like pushing a tiny tuft of fluff on top, and you're like, my God, this one just wants to flower. But the other ones, they weren't even showing their sex. So I said, okay, guys, I just want this one. You can have the other 1999. And they said, fantastic. And and then later they told me they thought that one was a male that I was taking, but it wasn't. It was beautiful. And it turned out beautiful pink hairs all, it just was so nice. And I didn't see another plant like it until I got to Risaralda department in Colombia, which is really the home of Punta Rojo. And I realized that first Jamaican I ever grew had the Punta Rojo. It was, you think of how much Colombian weed passed through Jamaica, and the seeds, for sure. It was unmistakable. It was like the same plant. It was so nice to see that. And it really has a special kind of lick'em stick smell, like a faint candy. I absolutely love Punta Rojo. It's really a beautiful plant. That's a special one for a Highland Colombian. That's still my favorite of the Highland Colombians, anyway, of the ones I've tried. For Lowland Colombian, for all the ones I've tried, my favorite is still Santa Marta Gold. And they're very different plants, but they're both gorgeous in their own way. But if you take some of these equatorial plants, whether lowland or highland, and you cross them with something very different, say a temperate climate or dry temperate climate, such as Afghan lines, which they're really desert plants from places that they're hot and dry in the summer and cold in the winter. And the plants don't grow they don't have all year to grow, let's say. They have a little shorter growing season. They're bred for hash, so they're more resinous typically. They're special on their own, but when you cross plants that are really that different is when you start to see what hybrid vigor really means. While working in Colombia, one time we did cross some CBD lines with some Punta Rojo and Santa Marta Gold and other tropicals and equatorials. And my goodness, the vigor was insane on those F1s because I knew how both of those plants grew in that environment on their own. And of course, the CBD higher latitude plants, they just flower immediately on the equator. They don't veg at all because of the 12-12 photo period. And the tropical plants that have evolved with that, they just continue to stretch. They take a very long time to flower, so they'll just keep growing, but they don't have as long a days. So those tropical plants, if you bring them up to Canada, where you have 18 hours of light in the summer, those plants will grow enormous, but they don't get as tall in Colombia because of the 12-12 factor. It keeps them a little more compact, but they'll still grow a good size. They'll still grow pretty tall. But once you cross those two, the vigor was insane. They put out, 3 times the size of plants than they would have on their own. So it was absolute, best example, I think, of hybrid vigor is the further apart the two genotypes you're using, the more extreme the hybrid vigor. So you can really look for that. But what I recommend, if you're growing your own and you're going to start breeding your own, start by stabilizing your favorite expressions of whatever you're using. And even if you got to start with a cross to begin with, to get going, make that cross and then see if you can't stabilize your favorites. That's kind of, it takes patience. It takes a few generations. Most people won't bother. They'll just make those and then they'll see something else shiny come by and they'll be, I'll cross it with that. I'll cross it with that as fast as they see, So you don't have to hit everything with everything as fast as you can. But if you want to, I'm not going to stop you. You go nuts. You can still find an exceptional plant in unstable lines. So if you want to be fancy, you can call them homozygous lines versus heterozygous lines. That's what people like to talk about in the educated breeding community. I think it's sometimes, just showing off, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. There's even the word cultivar, to some people, that means a variety, Mistakenly, the cannabis community's been using the misnomer strains for the longest time, even though there are only strains of virus or viroids or what have you. We all know what we mean, but it's nice to, start using the correct terms. I think it's same with the indica sativa. That was the normal thing to describe these different plant types for a long time, but it kind of became accepted that we could do better, so that's neither here nor there. No judgment if you still like to say either of those things, but a cultivar can be a specific clone. It could be a single clone only, can be a cultivar. Every sister in a seed selection, they can all be separate cultivars. A cultivar can be an individual plant, but some people use a cultivar to mean a seed line or a session, if you want to be fancy, but I just say line. It just seems less pretentious. But but feel free to use the longer term. It doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. So if you say variety, I think variety only applies if you're talking about a stabilized variety. So if it's not a stabilized variety, call it a line or an accession. If it's, absolutely rock solid, this is what it is, it looks like that every time, you've got a variety, you've made a new variety. So anyway, if you want to breed till you find yourself a new variety or develop one, you can do that. And then when you start crossing them, and especially if you've kept some narrow leaf equatorial tropical lines going, and maybe you've made your own super sativa, there's so much to draw on. Just if you went just to Southeast Asia, there's so much to draw on, let alone Africa or Central South America. There's such a wide diversity of the narrow leaf family, which hasn't been as utilized in modern breeding, because the focus on breeding in the developed nations for the last 40 years has really been on indoors, predominantly due to the fact that it had to be hidden. It had to be hidden from thieves. It had to be hidden from the government. But I repeat myself. You know what I'm saying. There's a reason why stuff has been bred to flower quickly and be compact and all that. It suits indoor growing and horticultural paradigm of production. And let's face it, some places like BC or anywhere Pacific Northwest, not necessarily the greatest environment for a lot of cannabis types. So sure, there's things that do finish up here, but it's not always what you want. A lot of people say, well, it finishes, but it's good enough to make distillate with for edibles or whatever, because it, tastes like ass. I don't really care how well finished it is if it still tastes like hay or onions or something. So the early outdoor stuff, generally speaking, doesn't totally float my boat. To be fair, I haven't done a lot with autoflowers in a long time. I really hadn't. I hear they've gotten a lot better. So, whatever you're happy with is the right thing to grow, So overall, I think, I'm not even touching on autoflowers today. I'm going to try what I just did, but it's not my focus. Is more the dioecious plants. And a big part of that is, the male, female, of course, is dioecious plants. It's nothing to do with auto or not. That's just the male-female breeding. A lot of the market wants feminized seeds, and there's a good reason for that. They're only allowed to grow 3 or 4 plants, and they don't want to waste time with males in their closet, which, they're paying electricity for and paying for the space. And, it's a lot of effort, and they don't want to waste space with males. And I appreciate that. But I do think that there's a caveat there, is that with dioecious plants, you're always keeping an eye out for males. But with feminized plants, the monoecious ones, you're always keeping your eye out for hermaphrodites, because there's a higher incidence of hermaphrodites in feminized seeds. There's things you can do to minimize it, and that's really important too. And one of those things would be to really go through the selections you're thinking about seeding and really stress the hell out of them, whether it's drought stress, heat stress, cold stress, light stress. There's different ways you can stress your plants. That the weaker ones, or the ones with a tendency to hermaphrodite, will express that hermaphroditism. So if you don't want to be continually having hermaphrodites, you want to really beat up your selection plants before you select them. And the ones that refuse to hermaphrodite under any kind of stress are good candidates for making feminized seeds that will have a low incidence of hermaphrodites. But that testing is really important, because there's been 20 years of focus on feminized seeds from the seed banks. And right now, hermaphroditism is probably at an all-time high. There's always been, even original cannabis was potentially hermaphrodite, right? So it's not an unnatural thing, but separating the male female has been the work of many generations of farmers who wanted to breed that out and have seedless flowers. So there's other ways to deal with it, such as virosense, which will be another episode to talk about. But, to avoid creating more hermaphrodites, that's kind of the key. If you're going to make feminized seeds, beat up the potential mothers first and make sure that they have no inclination to throw the banana. You all know what they look like, because by the time you're watching one of my episodes, I assume you're already growing your own at the very least. So where should we go from here? What have I got left to touch on here? Oh yeah, seed collection. So you're going to do some seed collecting. And by that, I mean drying out the buds and breaking them up. This is a perfect time to make hash. So if you like making hash, making seeds is just fine, because you're going to mash up those buds anyway over a screen, and you can have a series of screens. So the seeds are typically 2 to 5 millimeters inside. So I used to use stacking screens that I got from Mila, actually, from Holland, where she sent them to me in Switzerland. And I had first a small blower, a lab separator that came with the lab screens. And those lab screens weren't very big. They were maybe 30 centimeters by 20 centimeters, roughly the length of a ruler, and a little bit shorter across. But I think I had 6 screens. So there was the top screen to break them up on, and then they dropped by a millimeter the screens underneath. And then the finest stuff would just shake out the bottom, which could be hash at that point, or ready to, not quite hash, but suitable for further screening. So the bigger seeds, they stop in the higher screens, and they have bigger holes. These were metal sheets with the holes drilled in them to accommodate the different sizes of seeds. So the tops, right under the work screen, you would capture the biggest, fattest seeds, and the smallest seeds would drop to the very bottom screen. And it was a great way to do your primary sorting. But it worked out that that little desktop box wasn't nearly suitable for the greenhouses of flowers I had seeded. So I got her to make me a pallet-sized screen set. And these were made with 2x4s, I would say, that were the same drilled metal screens with the round holes, but they were made to be exactly the size of a pallet so that they could stack onto a pallet and she could ship them to me. And with that size of screen, I could have two people breaking up buds at either side of the screen set. So we could crush up, kilos and kilos of buds into there, and the seeds would fill up. We'd shake the pallet a bit and get the seeds all moving down. And we would take them out and put them into a blower that had a rheostat. So it had a funnel that dropped down and a collection box underneath it, and then a squirrel cage fan blowing through, and it was on a rheostat. So you could start very light. You didn't blow too much out. And, which I've definitely screwed up and done. But the idea is not to. So you start with it very light, you pour the seeds through, they trickle down, and the wind blows out all the fluffy stuff. If there's little bits of plant material or anything lighter than the seeds, it's blowing out. And then you can look at the seeds in the collection box and you go, yeah, there's still a bunch of white ones there. And this is also important to keep in mind, that you're just blowing seeds of one size from one of your collection screens. So when you want to have the seeds the same size, or this doesn't work. But so whichever millimeter seed you're blowing, the white ones are lighter than the dark ones. And really all you want is those dark ones at the end of the day. So you can decide how much you want to blow out by turning up the rheostat on that fan. And you may want to have a collection bag, I found, where the blower came, so that if you overdo it and you start sending out some good seeds, that they're not just wasted and on the floor. So a collection there. So I call that a primary blower. And you can get, just a few passes and turning up the fan gradually, you can get a good box of clean seeds fairly quickly. So it really beats the hell out of sorting them on an album cover or something, It's not possible. So from there, there's a secondary blower, which is more fine-tuned. So you can look them up for images or whatnot, but I'll describe them to you. So in this case, let's picture an upside down J made out of an acrylic tube. So at the bottom of the long part of the J is attached to a table, let's say, that has a fan mounted, and there's a screen there on that J. So you could take the elbow off the top that makes the J curve, take that off the top, use a funnel, and pour in your seeds, which are through the primary blower. Now you can put the elbow back on the top, have another collection screen bag or something for whatever's coming out, but you can gradually start turning up that fan and the seeds will start to float up, but the shittier ones will float higher and they'll come out. So you've just used air to float out the crap seed. So that blower is a good fine tuner. You shouldn't have, when we're packing seeds after that or putting them away for storage, you don't want to waste a bunch of space in there. You don't want to be sharing or selling immature seeds. You want to clean them out. So it's very important. And you want to make sure that they're fairly dry before you put them away as well. You don't have to typically dry them much more than you did while they were in the flower. If you've let the flower hang for, 2 weeks before you've separated the seeds have probably cured pretty good on the vine, as it were. They're beautiful seeds, whether you're eating them or planting them. they're special, but they just blow me away that how much information is in a seed. It just really is mind-boggling. I'm not qualified to really speak about molecular genetics, and there's people that can go way further down that rabbit hole, but I really enjoy learning about it. And lifelong student, I've always interested in checking out research that's happening and talking to people that know more about it than I do, which is many people. But, I'm not ashamed to learn. So it's really great if you want to learn more about it to have these talks and maybe even send stuff in for sequencing once you can, because the cost of it, when I first learned about the possibilities 25 years ago, it was prohibitive. If you weren't Monsanto or the US government, there was no chance that you had access to doing anything with that. But nowadays, the hardware and software involved has come along a long way, and it's become more and more accessible. So even if you want to use like a Chinese lab that's cheaper, you can definitely send DNA off to be sampled. Now, as a home hobbyist, you're probably not going to bother with that, but you can do it. That's just the interesting thing. It's good to know that you can do it, I think. It's not essential that you do, and you don't need to be doing any manipulation of, gene editing or anything. But isn't it nice to be able to look under the hood? Because if you can do that and you can get, reasonable priced, high volume, high throughput testing done, you can really narrow down selections for specific traits for whichever that you're after. It might be after a specific chemotype. You might say, oh, I really want to have THCV. So let's find which gene is the one that controls the production of THCV, and let's just select the plants that are dominant for it, and long before they've ever flowered, So if you can start sorting out your plants with some scientific authority ahead of having to finish them all, you're still going to finish them, but it's really more efficient. So, but that's really more applicable if you start to take your hobby to the next level and start saying, I want to do this commercially and I really want to get inside what's going on. So endless opportunity for growth within the hobby, So lots of people's hobbies can transition to their jobs because they say, if you do what you love, you never work a day in your life. But, it's all work. It really, at the end of the day, it's still work. And today it's harder than ever to go legally as a breeder. To grow as a breeder now, you require all the grow licenses, which are really based around commercial growers that are producing flower. If I wanted to, be a hobby breeder still, you really can't hardly anywhere. So it's, if you have 4 plants or 6 plants, what is that? You're not running a breeding program with 4 plants. So you're automatically going to be outside the lines. If you say, well, I'm going to start 10,000, I might only finish 4 plants, but I still want to start 10,000 seeds and then cull them and cull them and cull them. But that makes you a criminal. And so the same rules apply. 'Twas ever thus. If you're going to do it, you've got to keep an eye on what you're doing. And you can still have results on a small scale. And I think a prime example of this was DJ Short, legendary breeder who for years ran one closet, and he did selections from 250 seed lots on a 4x4 table with 1,000 watt. And he had a 400 watt for veg. And had to keep everything in a little closet, and that was still running a big risk at that time. But he did amazing work, and curated some very interesting international selections and developed them into some really legendary, distinctive cannabis. So, I have respect for people that can pull it off on a small scale. But the ideal is to be able to spread out and select from a little more space, that really helps. That we work with what we can, and that is the bottom line. Sometimes it's better to have a small breeding program than none at all, if that's your interest, so you go ahead and do it small, or seed a branch of your 4 plants, or cross one onto the others, or you could cross all 4 onto each other and have a matrix of 16 different crosses if you had 4 different clones. You could grow those out and see what grabs you, and say, hey, of those 16, these 2 crosses were the most successful. So I'm going to keep working with those. You don't know till you try. So don't be afraid to try. Get out there and check it out, and take your home growing to the next level, because you could find something that you're going to appreciate for a long time, and even that others may. I wish you all the best. I thank you for coming out to listen to another episode. I know I ramble on, and I'm glad you're tolerant of it. So have a great day or a great evening, wherever you are. And I look forward to bringing you another episode soon. Take care. Peace.